Welcome, everyone. People are just starting to slowly file in. We'll just take a few minutes to allow everyone to arrive, and then we'll begin probably about 5 minutes after the hour. While we're waiting for everyone to arrive, please feel free to say hello using the chat or by unmuting yourself. Feel free to say where you are today, since people are coming in from all over the world.
Hi. Ciao.
Hi, Francesco.
Ciao, Francisco. It's wonderful to see friends from France, from Budapest, from Georgia, from Montreal, from Los Angeles, and we'll begin in just another minute. We now have someone from Athens, Greece. Hello. Francesco from Salerno. New Jersey, Paris. Welcome, everyone. Okay, so I think we'll begin. Can everyone hear me okay? My name is Erin Graf-Zivin. I'm professor of Spanish and Portuguese and comparative literature at the University of Southern California, and for a few more days, distinguished visiting professor of literature at the University of California, San Diego. And it is an honor to chair this event, really a celebration of Geoff Bennington's latest book, Scatter 2, Politics and Deconstruction, which my screen doesn't want you to see because it's doing something strange. It is an ambitious book, as many of you know. It's the second part of the Scatter series. And today we have with us friends and colleagues who will be sharing responses to the book. And then Geoff will be responding to their responses. And at that point, we will really open it up to everyone for discussion, questions, comments, thoughts, greetings, congratulations. So I will introduce our three speakers today, and then we will go in that order. First, we have Simon Glendinning. I'm so sorry, I did not practice the pronunciation of your last name, who is head of the European Institute and professor of European philosophy at the London School of Economics, and political science. His 2-volume book, Europe, A Philosophical History, will be published in July. And he is currently writing a book called Giving Up the Ghost, Magic, Religion, Science, in which he relates the history of Europe's spiritual history as a history of attempts at the magical exorcism of ghosts. Peggy Kamuf is Professor Emerita of French and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California, Director of the Derrida Seminars Translation Project, and co-director with Jeff of the series, The Seminars of Jacques Derrida with University of Chicago Press. Her latest book is Literature and the Remains of the Death Penalty, which was published in 2019 with Fordham University Press. And last but not least, Naomi Waltham-Smith is Associate Professor in the Center for Interdisciplinary Methodologies at the University of Warwick. She works at the intersection of continental philosophy, sound studies, and music theory, and is the author of Music and Belonging Between Revolution and Restoration, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2017, and most recently, Shattering Biopolitics, Militant Listening, and the Sound of Life, which is just out from Fordham University Press. She is currently working on a third book, Mapping Post-Colonial Paris by Ear, which will be published by Cambridge University Press. And of course, Geoff Bennington, who needs no introduction, our man of the hour. So without further ado, I will pass the mic to Simon.
Well, thank you very much, Erin. I hope everybody can hear me okay. It's indeed an honor to be here and to congratulate Geoff today on the publication of this wonderful book. Wonderful to be here wherever here is. It's a very scattered gathering in a space of virtual spectrality, as always, no doubt, in one way or another. Well, I had the other honor, the great honor of, and a great pleasure, I should say, as well, to read both Scatter 1 and Scatter 2 for Fordham. My reports were quite long and quite detailed, and I only have 10 minutes now. So in summary of what I said about Scatter 1, with respect to his reading of Fantasies of Political Speech, which might just tell it how it is, without the politics of politics, that would in fact always be inscribed there, I said it was unceasingly brilliant, and that the depth, breadth, and bristling erudition of his book is simply breathtaking. And I can tell you, Geoff, that is telling it how it is. For Scatter 2, with respect to his reading of the long voyage through history of a line from Homer quoted by Aristotle, and the immense afterlife it has had in Western metaphysics and in European political philosophy, the line that runs so quotably, "The rule of many is not good, let there be one ruler." On the deconstructive narration of the voyage of that tagline, as he calls it sometimes, I said, it is quite brilliant, and introduces a way of reading the tradition of that tagline into our time, I said, with mesmerizing brilliance. Geoff, I believe it to be so. So I was dazzled by brilliance, no doubt, reading both wonderful volumes. In both cases, Scatter 1 and Scatter 2, I conceived this brilliance not only as superb scholarship, which it is, but also as timely. I said in the second report that it's a decisive book for our time. It's my honest opinion, Geoff, that it is so. So I could leave it there. But because I love Geoff and I love his work, I will also raise the ghost of a but in the face of this brilliance. The discussion of the voyage of the tagline in Scatter 2 reaches a kind of summary condensation of its classical rendering in the slogan, what he calls a slogan, democracy is sovereignty failing. It's a richly ambiguous slogan, actually. It's not just a description of a certain rendering of the tagline, but as it were, it reaches inside it for something that goes beyond it. But it's a richly ambiguous summary point that leads Jeff into a reading first of Hobbes. And that seemed to me exactly the right place to go next. And in my report, I'd said this: as Derrida notes near the opening of The Beast and the Sovereign, it is with Hobbes that modern, supposedly secular political theory really begins. It's where the theory of sovereignty supposedly loses its Christian character. Derrida goes on to show in his book that this suggestion, which would, he admits, be a real problem for him if it was not so, is not what is going on in Hobbes at all. God remains sovereign, and the political sovereign is his deputy. It's still ontotheology. And it was at that point where Jeff's book meets Hobbes in an account of a history of the thought of sovereignty that I thought Jeff missed a chance to integrate something in his own way of avoiding prescriptions, what he says at the outset he wants to avoid, a way of integrating something into his own way of avoiding prescriptions for a political program that could have not avoided what one might call a political hope for a future of sovereignty. One where, as Derrida himself puts it, when he's looking at this ontotheological inheritance inside Hobbes, and when I say Derrida puts it, in fact, he's borrowing the form of his words from Carl Schmitt, who Jeff also does touch on here and there. Taking his form of words from Carl Schmitt, Derrida talks about seeing the task today as working on the possibility of creating the honest fiction of a sovereignty, an honest fiction of a sovereignty that doesn't constantly suffer from the kind of moralizing hubris, the self-righteous pride and vanity, the prideful human craving to be God or his deputy, or simply as masters of the earth, putting on sheriff badges for ourselves. Sovereignty beyond dominion, beyond deputized sovereignty as it's presented in Genesis. Actually, it's a very interesting thing to note, Jeff, in this context, that when the Bible in Genesis talks about being made in his likeness, the first specification of being made in the likeness of God is the gift of dominion, of deputized sovereignty. With the idea of the honest fiction of a sovereignty, there is at least something like a hope of thinking sovereignty beyond dominion and mastery. And so my question to Jeff, my little but that doesn't interrupt my sense of the dazzling brilliance of his book, but wanting more, I guess, is why, Jeff, did you want to avoid that, as it were, hope, a political hope for the future of sovereignty? Not as a conclusion, but in fact, what Derrida says is that it's what we're working on. It wouldn't be about trying to say, well, let's conclusively conclude now with a vision of sovereignty to come that would be the right way of going about everything. On the contrary, when Derrida talks about this, he says, more or less, I literally have no idea what is going to frame itself inside that idea of the honest fiction of a sovereignty. So not as a conclusion, but as an expression of what we're still working on, will perhaps always only ever be working on in the manner of a sovereignty to come. So that's my short question, my ghost question on what Jeff has written and perhaps not yet written. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Simon. Peggy.
Thank you, Erin. And I also want to thank Jonathan Basil for asking me to discuss Jeff's amazing book with you. And what I've prepared are some almost random remarks that were, or at least they were determined by the chance circumstance that before I finished reading Scatter 2, I was prompted by another assignment to reread Spectres of Marx. And putting these two side by side turned out to be a very illuminating, at least for me, exercise, as if each acted as a kind of reading lamp, projecting its preoccupations, its key ideas onto the other. Scatter and specters. These titling words at some point in my reading experience began not just to rhyme in their phonemic syllabic patterns, scatter, specter, but to be almost synonyms, or at least pointing to the same thing. A thing, of course, that is difficult to encompass, whose meaning or referent, justement, scatters, or perhaps specters. So with your indulgence, I'm going to follow out some associations between these two important works, which will no doubt yield somewhat, dare I say, scattershot remarks. One certainly doesn't have to look far into Scatter 2 for a place to begin this exercise. The first line of its, introduction begins with a quote from Specters. And I quote, "To be means to inherit." And Jeff thereby aligns his undertaking with the task of inheritance as it is analyzed and enacted in Specters. Now, Derrida lays this out most succinctly, perhaps, in chapter 1 of Specters, which is called Injunctions of Marx, in a passage that I'm going to quote at a little length. And in this, I'm following Jeff's example of quoting generously, so generously. So this is Derrida. Let us consider, first of all, the radical and necessary heterogeneity, of an inheritance, the difference without opposition that has to mark it, a disparate and a quasi-juxtaposition without dialectic, the very plural of what we will later call Marx's spirits. An inheritance is never gathered together. It is never one with itself. Its presumed unity, if there is one, can consist only in the injunction to reaffirm by choosing. One must means one must filter, sift, criticize, one must sort several different possibles that inhabit the same injunction and inhabit it in a contradictory fashion around a secret. If the readability of a legacy were given, natural, transparent, univocal, if it did not call for and at the same time defy interpretation, we would never have anything to inherit from it. We would be affected by it as by a cause, natural or genetic. One always inherits from a secret, which says, read me, will you ever be able to do so? The critical choice called for by any reaffirmation of the inheritance is also, like memory itself, the condition of finitude. The infinite does not inherit. It does not inherit from itself. The injunction itself says, choose and decide from among what you inherit. The injunction can only be one by dividing itself, tearing itself apart, differing, deferring itself by speaking at the same time, several times and in several voices. Now, I'm sure you will have heard in this long quote the many echoes with what Jeff so multifariously tracks and designates as scatter, which is never one with itself, in Derrida's phrase, as well as with the pluralization of the injunction that, like the rule of one decreeing itself preferable to the rule of many, has to divide itself, defer itself without end. This irreducibility, divisibility of the one is what Geoff so masterfully demonstrates through, for example, the multiple readings of the lines from the Iliad that Simon has just recalled, with their ostensible injunction to obey only one master, and which end up speaking, as Derrida puts it, the same time several times and in several voices. Finally, and finally only because time is limited, there is the emphasis of the passage that the passage places on reading. It's summing up the injunction to inherit with the imperative, read me, before adding, will you ever be able to do so? What is called here readability is not the quality of patency. Readable text is not one that offers no resistance to being read. On the contrary, it is the quality of a certain secret of whatever says, commands, or pleads, read me, where the me is irreducibly other than the reader, and where, moreover, there is always more than one possibility inhabiting the injunction. The reader, the heir, chooses, must choose, is choosing, and all the more so when they don't realize it, what to inherit. One must sort out different possibles inhabiting the same inheritance. And here, to inhabit is a synonym in Spectres of Marx for to haunt. Speaking of a work like Hamlet, Derrida says, the animated work becomes the thing that, like an elusive speaker, engineers a habitation without proper inhabiting. Call it a haunting. Which is to say that texts are haunted, and by more than one specter or ghost, and that reading is enjoined to choose among them, choose what to inherit, to understand, to read. Now, from these threads that draw together specters and scatter, I want to follow a little further the thread of the pluralization of the injunctions. One place in Scatter 2 where this problematic condition is seemingly invoked comes in chapter 8 in the course of Geoff's tenacious reading of Hobbes, especially of Hobbes on reading. And you recall that a key articulation is the difference Hobbes wants to make, wants to see or to find among several different injunctive, imperative speech acts, which Hobbes calls command, counsel, and exhortation, dehortation. Here's the first passage that Geoff quotes from chapter 25 of Leviathan of Counsel. So this is Hobbes. Okay. Sorry. How fallacious it is to judge of the nature of things by the ordinary and inconstant use of words appeareth in nothing more than in the confusion of counsels and commands, arising from the imperative manner of speaking in them both, and in many other occasions besides. For the words do this are the words not onely, and I, when I was typing this out, I had noticed that old spelling of only, and thought maybe Geoff missed a chance by not kind of remarking on it. Not only of him that commandeth, but also of him that giveth counsel, and of him that exhorteth. I'm tempted to trace a line between these three modes of the imperative manner of speaking, and, for example, the plural injunctions that Derrida in the wake of Blanchot hears as the three voices of Marx, or even the ghost's address to Hamlet. Is it commanding, counseling, or exhorting? As Geoff knows, for Hobbes, a key to avoiding the confusion of the imperative modes is a certain self-reading that takes the measure of another's thoughts and passions by reading one's own. Having read oneself, one will be able to read and know the other, any other, or so at least Hobbes wants to believe. Therefore, read thyself, Hobbes counsels or exhorts, if not commands. And Geoff quotes from the introduction to Leviathan this: Nose te ipsum, read thyself, was meant to teach us that for the similitude of the thoughts and passions of one man to the thoughts and passions of another, whosoever looketh into himself shall thereby read and know what are the thoughts and passions of all other men upon the like occasions. This is sovereign reading, because it is a model for he that is to govern a whole nation and who, quote, must read in himself not this or that particular man, but mankind. That's quoted in Scatter 2 on page 239. But first of all, because it supposes the rule of the one, who is every other one, without dissension. One man equals all other men. Furthermore, it is sovereign insofar as it would exercise control and surveillance, as Geoff puts it, over reading in general in any normal sense, which is to say, over this most unruly, suspect, and seditious exercise when it is not brought under the purview of the one. When it is, in other words, the terrain of scatter, reading as scattered, where, quote, every other is every bit other, to invoke that unforgettable, untranslatable phrase of Derrida's, and where the imperative demand or command is not read thyself, but read me. Read my several voices that counsel, command, exhort, or dehort, but also plead, question, supplicate, demand, etc., without clear distinction. You must decide and choose which you will hear. Well, Geoff's reading of Hobbes is resolutely non-sovereign, as he puts it, in the attention it pays to the non-unitary forces at work in a text whose meanings, as declared and as described, diverge, contradict, or dissent from one another. But it is especially in its inheritance of Hobbes as a thinker of democracy, of an irreducible and irrepressible proto-democracy, as Geoff calls it, that Geoff's is a resolutely non-sovereign reading. And I quote the conclusion of the chapter on Hobbes. This is Geoff now. Between what Hobbes declares and what he describes, more or less in spite of himself, or between what he says he means and what he actually does in his writing, there emerges for us the possibility of what I would tentatively claim to be a democratic reading of Hobbes, one that runs counter to his own dream of sovereign, non-interpretive reading, and in so doing, tries to bring out the ways in which sovereignty is, as always, failing from the start. The possibility of a democratic reading, and the last word, as you see, is in italics. This is one of the possible inheritances that, as we read from Specters, inhabit the injunction to choose among them. The phrase democratic reading itself admits of several readings. It would be a reading that, as here, as Geoff is doing, retrieves an irrepressible democratic strain from political thought, thus a democratic reading by metonymy, if you will, with its aim or its theme. But might it not also be one that reads democratically? And what would that mean? By what marks or traits would one recognize a democratic reading in this sense? Well, I'm not at all sure where I'm going with these questions. I believe I am trying to connect this idea of a democratic reading to Derrida's assertion that one always inherits from a secret. That is, from a certain unknowability and incalculability, which also governs any relation to the future. A democratic reading would have to be one that welcomes the unknowable future event of some other, some not one, some plus d'un or plus d'un, in the phrase that recurs many, many times in Spectres. As translators like me and Jeff often point out, the ordinary sense of the phrase is more than one, but it can also be made to say no more of one. I can't recall if Jeff singles the phrase out here as he does some other ways Derrida inflects the idiomatic uses of one, un, une. And he has done it elsewhere, I realize, but I'm not sure that it's foregrounded in Scatter 2. But regardless, it has an obvious place in his analysis, approaching as it does to a watchword for democracy, which is the government of more than one, no more of just one. One may also be reminded of the elliptical definition of deconstruction that Derrida gave on more than one occasion, which was plus d'une langue, where the phrase likewise doubles its possible readings, more than one language, no more of just one language. That deconstruction and democracy should each unfold under the sign of the plus d'un is of course anything but a coincidence, at least not if you endorse, as Jeff doubtless would, the mutual conditionality of the one and the other, which Derrida once again stamped into what sounds like a slogan, a motto, or a watchword. No deconstruction without democracy, no democracy without deconstruction. That's from Politics of Friendship. In reflecting about the plural injunctions of the inheritance, I was led to wonder about Scatter 2's own deployment of imperatives, if indeed there are any. I have not systematically combed the text for moments that might correspond, at least semantically or syntactically, to what Hobbes distills into the do this that commander, counselor, and exhorter might all be heard to utter. My suspicion or my wager, once again, is that in his own name, at least, Bennington rarely, if ever, invokes the imperative mode. I surmise this is in part from his repeated dismissal of what he calls moralism in political philosophy. All the same, I did come upon one such imperative, albeit a rather paradoxical one. It comes in the introduction to Scatter 2 at the point where Jeff claims a militant dimension for his performance of what he calls simply reading, and doing so with what he describes as, quote, a kind of willed and therefore not completely naive naivete. Here's the passage. This claim to naivete itself has a political and even militant dimension. It wants to say that these texts, however difficult, however overwritten by the traditions of reading we also inherit, are nonetheless still at least minimally freshly readable for us, in principle for anyone here today. Feel free to just read, I say. In the face of all the complex machineries of scholarship and disciplinarity that can certainly inform reading, but that also police it and sometimes function as an obstacle to it. Feel free to just to read, I say. It's unmistakably imperative, and yet it also cancels or suspends its imperative compulsion by freeing the addressees, here anyone today, freeing them just to read. I'm sorry, I realize I'm a little long, so I'm trying to condense this. All of this is to say that I was set puzzling over this thing being called in some syntax or other, just reading. In the passage just quoted, Geoff suggests that just reading is what the machineries of scholarship and disciplinarity can censure, block, or disable, even as they also enable it as more informed, less naive reading. These machineries then cannot simply be excluded from just reading, not if it is to be just in the other sense of doing justice, here to a text or a work, not if one is just to read it and as what is freshly readable for us. In other words, freshly inherited. The phrase could also seem to imply some distillation of reading down to its essential act, called just reading, in which case it poses a paradox no less suspensive or suspended than the feel free of the imperative. For just reading is perhaps, for we who must also inherit, what suspends one in a relation to the inheritance that is each time always freshly readable, in principle for anyone, which is also to say, each time, every time, different. Can I have just a couple more minutes? I'll finish. And
Yes, you're fine, Peggy.
This brings me back one last time to specters. In a parenthesis there, Derrida poses a thesis or hypothesis that takes in perhaps what we've just been saying about just reading, which it extends to just thinking, just acting, and just writing. Derrida is here reading the German ideology, tracking down Marx's tracking down of Stirner's ghosts. Why this acharnement, he asks, this hounding of Stirner, before going on to add, and this is Derrida, I have my own feeling on this subject, and mon propre sentiment in French. And this apparent confession of a feeling is what prompts the parenthesis. So here's my last quote. I insist that it is a feeling, my feeling, and I have no reason to deny that it projects itself necessarily into the scene I am interpreting. My thesis, my hypothesis, or my hypostasis, precisely, is that it is never possible to avoid this precipitation, since everyone reads, thinks, acts, writes with his or her ghosts, even when one goes after the ghosts of the other. Just reading, thinking, acting, writing, then, is never just the same if one follows this hypothesis that everyone does these things with their ghosts, their own ghosts. It is here perhaps that it connects, like democratic reading, to a secret, a scattered or scattering secret that enjoins something like, read me, just read me. Will you ever be able to do so? All of that being said, I know of no finer elucidation of the secrets of the phrase, just reading, than scatter too. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Peggy. Naomi.
Thanks ever so much. Peggy, I think you've precipitated a number of those comments, but you also dramatically showed up what I was about to say, which is that I had a number of scattered thoughts, and I thought they might have been somewhat more gathered by now, by the time the event had come. And I thought that might let me off the hook a little bit if I said my thoughts were scattered. But Peggy, I believe you just said yours were, and they were far more gathered and beautifully articulated than mine. So I'm sorry to follow that. If anything, in trying to prepare to say something this evening, I found my thoughts not simply scattered, perhaps even more shattered, to use a word that I have somewhat bastardized, from Geoff Scatter in some work that I've been doing on the politics of sound and listening. And I felt particularly shattered when I found myself in a situation failing to resist the drive to identify with moralism. And then I bargained with myself that one could not in any event purify oneself of all moralism. There was no point in being dogmatically anti-moralist. That would be moralistically anti-moralist. There was no point sneering at moralism when it's just, at least to some extent, unavoidable. Or so I tried to assuage myself. And yet I found myself also having to confess that I had perhaps chosen shatter over scatter, perhaps because it was a little bit more like telling it how it is, or speaking truth up to power, punching up. Perhaps that was a little bit more palatable to me because it stung more. Perhaps I really liked those blows. Perhaps I really was seduced by moralism. And at the risk of seeming narcissistic, I'm just going to quote very briefly what I say about shatter. And then, so that I want to then move on to passages in Geoff's, in both Scattered 1 and Scattered 2. But I said that, I don't know if I would still say this, but I did when I wrote it. There are for me a number of reasons to like shatter and even to prefer it, sorry, Geoff, over scatter. Intuitively, it suggests a degree of forcefulness, the shattering impact of capital, as well as the idea of exemplarity and of listening as battery and percussion. It tears lives asunder, wrecks livelihoods, frays nerves, and dashes spirits. It is the sigh or the cry that shakes the body's frame. Dispensing with every hint of patriarchal reproductive metaphor, it instead captures the violence of the blows and wounds inflicted by neoliberal hyperproductivity and insecurity. Shatter, perhaps more intuitively than scatter, does not so much indicate the falling short of some ideal as it affirms the ruin of sovereignty and of the transcendental position in general from the outset. And then I go on to say that I take the term shatter from the very end of Derrida's final seminar from the Bête et le Souverain, where he's referring to the hyper-sovereignty of Walten and uses the term Scheiert to talk about the Scheitert, to talk about the shattering of sovereign violence. And then I also go on to say that some anxieties that I have about scatter are the link that Geoff makes with scatting, jazz performance style, improvisatory, or at least designed to appear improvisatory and spontaneous. But scatting in the writings on jazz is often associated with some kind of affective immediacy, or perhaps with some kind of contact with madness or unreason. But at the same time, it's often seen also to signify great virtuosity or mastery of vocal technique and control, even if it's done in the guise of being somewhat out of control. So there's something in scatting that seems to want to seize hold of madness or unreason, which I think is something that Geoff is warning us in some ways not to do. But anyway, I'm not sure I would prefer shatter anymore because it also has its problems, perhaps its demagogic blows. But I thought it would be one way to introduce this to say a few words about music and moralism in relation to Scatter 1 and Scatter 2. And so it got me thinking, what would Plato, who's very important here in this book for this notion of poikolon, what would Plato have made of scatting? Would he also have dismissed it as being too poikolos in some way? And we can think of Adorno dismissing and censoring jazz, especially its improvisatory moments, in a very moralistic kind of fashion. And in the Republic, talking about mimetic poetry, Plato dismisses melodies, rhythms, and harmonies that would make, if one heard them, would make the soul more fretful, would incline the soul to wailing and lamentation in some way, in a way that I think, Geoff, at one point, when I first heard you present live, when I first met you in person for the first time, you commented that Aristotle will, in complaining about this, was sounding all too British in some way. So there is a sense in which this kind of, there might be a moralistic kind of condemnation, perhaps, of this poikolon sound in some way that might be there in scatting, if I'm pushing it. But I want really, I'll come back maybe to sound and listening, but I want at the end, but I want to say a little bit more about this question of moralism that is announced in the first volume at that point as something that will come more in Scatter 2. But in Scatter 1, Geoff introduces it in this way, and I'm going to quote, "This book does not entirely accept this pervasive and persuasive scenario, which in its essential features has been available to left and right for almost a century, not so much by disagreeing frontally with the detail of its diagnosis of global capitalism and its ongoing effects, the kind of litany that I had in my own text, nor indeed by recommending or condoning lying and cheating, but by putting some pressure on the philosophical ground from which such claims are usually made. That ground is often enough one of a dogmatism and moralism that are more or less indirectly complicit with what they purport to attack, and that depend on loudly declared and self-righteous indignation, covering for a deeper complacency and failure of thought." I certainly felt chastised in reading this, probably each time I read it. So against this, Geoff proposes, as we all know from the book, the notion of the politics of politics that is always already there, a kind of contamination, if you like, that is always there, is originally in some way, is not an evil that later befalls politics. And hence the dogmatism of any position that attempts to kind of purify politics of that, or to purify philosophy of its entanglement with the dirty side of realpolitik in some way. And Geoff gives a more, in a footnote, gives a more specific definition, says, "I use the term moralism, quote, to describe the result of presuming to derive practical prescriptions from supposed theoretical truths." And it's against this in Scatter 2, in the introduction, that he says that the politics of politics is co-originary with politics, quote, "such that there is no conceivable politics unaffected by the politics of politics." And this politics of politics ought to disallow, though not at all in a spirit of relativism, the kinds of appeal to the concept of truth rather differently proposed by Foucault or Badiou, and so also disallow the moralism still today endemic in political philosophy, and indeed in political discourse more generally. And there are various expressions in Scatter 2 of some sympathy, for example, for the position of Hart and Negri, but also pointing out these tendencies to succumb to moralism, even while also cautioning us that there is some inevitability about that we can't entirely save or rescue ourselves from moralism. But in order to push a little bit further with this question, what would it really mean if there is this notion of just reading that Peggy has been talking about? What would it mean? What would this kind of philosophy be? And I want to come back specifically to the idea of what would a kind of just listening be that avoided these kind of traps of being entirely kind of seduced and ensnared within an overly dogmatic or demagogic moralism. And I think there's a footnote in Scatter 1 that kind of gives us a hint, or at least gave me a hint. It's a reference to a passage in Apore where Derrida is talking about Heidegger, and he's kind of criticizing the characterization, Heidegger's characterization of death as the possibility of impossibility. And that's exactly the problem that is also at stake at the very end of Le Bête et le Souverain. This question of possibilizing or making possible, appropriating or somehow mastering impossibility, making impossibility something of which I would be capable in some way. And then at the risk, I said these were scattered thoughts, so do forgive the sort of gaping holes that I'm jumping over here. But I think one would also want to connect this with the idea of a decision. So one thing to say is, well, if we don't have these moralizing, dogmatic kinds of statements, like, is that just an emptying out of politics, absolving us of that kind of responsibility of politics? And Jeff's kind of response to this is that it actually, you know, it makes truth a matter for decision. And so it's not at all this question of kind of absolving from any kind of political responsibility. But this decision, somewhat kind of crucially, is one in which I must always remain in a certain kind of ignorance or passivity. He says this is in Scatter 1. Otherwise, one would end up with some kind of voluntarism in some way. And so it's this notion that we find in Politique de l'Amitié of a passive decision, one that must kind of arrive in some way. And so it's this sense that the decision is not mine that makes me wonder, besides reading, in which we are responsible to the other, what about this question of a just listening? There's a lot that's about speech in Scatter 1 and Scatter 2. But there are also some moments where listening comes to the fore, in particular in the discussion of Foucauldian parousia in Scatter 1, or elsewhere in that first book where Jeff talks about the notion that the Kantian idea can only be heard as a call. And so I think with that, I want to try and yoke together these problems of moralism with this kind of question of the passive decision as one that comes to us from the other, from the heart of the other, the heartbeat of the other, that kind of puts us in a position of responding to the, if not the call of the other, right? At different points, these things, especially in his debates, Derrida's debates with Nancy, sometimes this is a question of an imperative, sometimes a call, sometimes a question, perhaps closer with Cixous. It is a question of these imperatives, these injunctions in some way. But in any case, there's some question of a response. And it's this question of response that is crucial for removing this possibility of mastering the impossible or of appropriating it, possibilizing it in some way. And so I know that Simon needs to be able to hear Jeff's response, so I'm going to wind up and sort of really just say that what I wanted to ask about was whether, besides this just reading that Peggy has mentioned, thinking motivated here by the all too gathered silence that Derrida discusses in Heidegger and Geschlecht 3, but also, Jeff, your comments elsewhere about dissemination as a kind of monotony, whether we might also think that Scatter 1 and Scatter 2 are books about reading and about just reading, but might they not also be books, perhaps less overtly, about a just listening that wouldn't be straightforwardly a distracted listening of the kind that Peter Stendi talks about, but a scattered listening. And so at the risk that my own monotony, my own hammering on about listening might be scattering your ears or inducing just sleepy boredom on your part, I'm going to stop there and apologize for my rather scattered remarks.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Before I pass the mic to Jeff, I'd like to invite you all to submit questions or comments via the chat function. When we're finished, you can also just raise your hand, but as you're thinking of questions and comments, feel free to enter them now and we'll have a sense of a queue, because we will have a few moments afterwards for discussion. So without further ado, Jeff, the man of the hour.
Thank you, Erin, and everybody else. This is kind of moving and slightly unsettling experience for me. A little bit like, as I once heard Jack say at a conference, a little bit like being at my own funeral. But let me thank everybody, of course, for being here, especially Erin and Jonathan, who took the initiative to organize this event. It's really great to see you guys, some of whom I haven't seen for a long time, with some of whom I go way back, decades back. It's genuinely very moving for me to have you be here and to take an interest in this book. I'm going to rapidly try and say something to Simon because I know he has to leave, and I probably won't manage to get in the response that his questions deserve. Let me also put in a plug for Simon's forthcoming book, his 2-volume Philosophical History of Europe, which I've had the privilege of reading, and which is a really magnificent work that I'm sure you're all going to want to read the moment it's published. Just quickly, Simon, and I won't here reflect on the nature of the stunt you pulled by going back to your reader's report and checking that I hadn't in fact responded to it in the final version of the book. There's something we might want to talk more about around that. But you're right, of course, as other people have commented, that I was wary of issuing prescriptions or injunctions of my own. I'll come back in a minute to what Peggy said about the one exception to that. What I'd like to suggest, perhaps, beyond recognizing that the question you put about Hobbes and some of Derrida's remarks explicitly about Hobbes, and my having missed an opportunity to say something about that, apart from the fact that that just seemed too difficult and daunting at the point where I would have needed to take it on. I would like to try to link that I have no idea, the sort of hope for sovereignty, but in what that hope consists, I have no idea, as you say, quoting Derrida. Of course, I want to relate that to the things that Peggy and Naomi have both said very generously about reading and what's at stake in reading in what I take to be a just deconstructive way or spirit. In other words, letting something happen, allowing the other to arrive, perhaps allowing the arriver to surprise me, and that's already for me something to do with that. I'm not sure I would say a hope for sovereignty, but certainly a hope that has a political dimension, I think. So I think it's possible to link together what you were hoping I might have said, Simon, and what in fact I did say in different places and in different ways about this notion of reading. And let me just say another thing or two about that reading, partly because Simon, but not only Simon, has commented that this is a book that, I think you said, Simon, it bristles with erudition. And this is something that amuses me, because I really do not have a great deal of erudition in the domains that I'm venturing into in a fairly experimental and almost following my nose through. And I think there's an interesting relationship between erudition and reading already. And I'll take an example, because as some of you will have noticed, and I hope I'm reasonably upfront about it, a lot of the more surprisingly erudite details, of course, I didn't find all on my own. I found quite a lot of them in a work by a Belgian scholar, Nicole, what's her name? Something van der Voort, long complex Flemish name. You'll have noticed. I'm afraid I'm spacing on the exact name. And she has a book from the early 70s about the quotation of Greek poets in Christian apologists of the 2nd century. And for reasons that perhaps we needn't go into, I found my way to this book in which I found a lot of the reference points that I then go and pursue. And one thing I'm interested in that book is that I'm very admiring of the genuine erudition that that book shows, as opposed to my own bogus show of erudition. But I'm also struck, and it's not the only time, I'm sure we've all had this experience, by the fact that alongside that erudition, there is a total failure or lack of interest in this thing that we call reading. So whatever the very many virtues of that book and the many hours and years of patient scholarship that took to produce it, it struck me that it's really rather extraordinary that the nearest that that author comes to a theoretical question is to lament the fact that because of the fragmentary nature of the evidence relating to these different authors who quote the Greek poets, we are thereby impeded in gaining insight into their personality. So it's as if the true theoretical ambition, if one could only realize it, would be to get some insight into the personality of Clement of Alexandria, for example. And this seems to me such an extraordinary and extraordinarily naive, in this case, genuinely naive gesture, that it had me thinking about that relationship between erudition and reading, and made me bolder, I think, in stepping out beyond what many models of scholarship would consider appropriate and sticking my neck out in readings of authors and periods and genres and traditions that in a sense I don't know enough about. And the reading takes place against the background of that not knowing or not knowing enough or never knowing enough, and somehow affirming in that militant way that Peggy quoted me as saying, that I can still read this material and everybody else should be able to feel free to read that material. So that's the kind of militant aspect of it. The other thing, I see Simon's gone, so I won't be able to relate this to his notion of hope, is that the relationship of that to my endemic and probably, I think Naomi's picked this up and made it clear, probably excessive suspicion of what I call moralism, and my hypersensitivity, let's put it that way, to what I call moralism. That's also related to a figure who has loomed large in a lot of the work I've done, but doesn't appear so much in Scatter 2, and that's Jean-François Lyotard, who in his book of interviews, Au Juste, which is unfortunately translated as Just Gaming, Lyotard talks about piety. Piety was the word he used for pretty much, I think, the same as what I'm calling moralism. And one thing that Lyotard, who certainly was fearful of nobody, one thing he waded right in and said is that the left, this is a book of interviews that took place in the late 1970s in France, that the left is endemically pious, and that's a problem because what Lyotard calls justice is in a sense antithetical to piety in that way. Justice happens, it's not formulated quite in Derridian terms, but it certainly has to do with this unpredictable arrival of the other, which must be something one is open to or tries to make possible or tries to maintain as a possibility. And for Lyotard in the 70s, that was being closed down, unfortunately, on the left. The other side of that diagnosis, which is still relevant, I think, today, is that he's certainly not saying that the right wing had anything to do with justice. They're neither pious nor just. They don't care about justice, and they're not pious, but their lack of piety is one of the things that makes the left vulnerable in various politically specifiable ways. So I think that's also part of the picture that you guys have helped pick out, where the stress on reading is supposed to have a political or quasi-political import. That import is certainly related to the just reading, even though I don't think I played on that possibility explicitly, but Peggy brought it out. And that just reading implies something of a relinquishment or perhaps foolhardy exhibition of a lack of mastery in certain ways, that mastery taking the form of an erudition, which, as I say, and I'm sure for many of us this is the case, is largely borrowed from other sources where there's a notable absence of reading in most cases. Then the last thing I'll say about that, and maybe see if there's any response. Let me not, in fact, say it. Let me stop there for now, and we'll see what comes back. So I don't know if Peggy or Naomi wants to come back, or if we're opening. I see there are some questions in the chat, but I'm not necessarily going to be able to decipher them rapidly enough.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Yes, let's give Peggy and Naomi an opportunity to respond, and then we have a question that Sergio will read. I'll invite him to read, and in the meantime, everyone else should feel free to write questions or comments in the chat, or simply raise their hands.
Well, I could say too that I understand and appreciate what Jeff just said about kind of borrowed erudition, if you will, or a piggybacked erudition, but I do think you're being overly modest in a bit, because Jeff, because Scatter 2, I didn't reread Scatter 1. I read Scatter 1 when it was first out, but I haven't reread it since then. But Scatter 2, it strikes me even more so, I suppose because of the arc, at least of the first part, particularly, that is so remarkable in following out the tagline, that I understand what you mean. And then that quote I gave, where you talk about the complex machineries of scholarship that work to block, or can work to block and disable just reading. Nevertheless, one has to read a lot. I mean, it's a lot of reading that is mobilized in Scatter 2. Maybe, kind of running around the end, doing end runs around those complex machineries that you point to, and not getting kind of caught up in the minutiae of that sort of scholarship. But nevertheless, there is on evidence in Scatter 2 a lot of just reading, and I think that's to be applauded and celebrated. I mean, just reading in the kind of simple sense of reading widely and generously the texts that we encounter is becoming something of a lost art. And I'm sure that that was also part of your awareness and something you are militantly opposing. That's,
Thanks for that. If I could piggyback on that and then say something along the lines of what I was going to say when I stopped. This is partly a memory. It's a confessional moment in a certain sense. Is that one of the first philosophical texts I ever read, in the sense of picking up the book and starting at the beginning and reading through to the end, was, don't laugh, was Locke's essay concerning human understanding. It's not that I hadn't encountered some philosophy before that, but I certainly had never been taught philosophy, qua philosophy. It was as a literary person by training that I read Locke. And I found Locke pretty interesting. I subsequently realized Hobbes is much more interesting, but Locke is pretty interesting along similar lines, similar repressions, similar terribly inadequate theory of language and various things that flow from that. And I'd had a pretty good time reading Locke, just reading Locke. I didn't know any scholarship. I didn't read the introduction. I just read the book. And when I raised it with a colleague, a philosopher, the first thing he said was, nobody reads the whole book. And the second thing he wanted to talk about was Locke's theory of something, which in his case was mediated through so many relays and so much intervening scholarship and philosophical movements, that the version of it that he was familiar with, and he was very familiar with it, bore very little resemblance with anything I'd actually read in the book. And I subsequently had similar experiences with quite a few philosophical texts, a lot of Kant. I've written about this elsewhere, but in the case of Kant, the reading experience I was able to have was very hard for me to synchronize with what I knew was supposed to be in the book. And there was a kind of drift or something that didn't quite fit, or a use in the discussions of Kant of a vocabulary that's not Kant's. It's just how people talk about Kant now, but you wouldn't know that reading Kant because they've developed a whole kind of specific Kantian meta-language. Something similar a little bit with Hegel, but that's a harder story probably. So there's an autobiographical underpinning which is not without its own militancy about the relationship between reading and philosophy. And because of Derrida, it's indubitably because of Derrida, for many years at least, and including now, most of the texts I read are texts of philosophy. I read more philosophy than I read fiction these days, or poetry, or the other things that I was trained up to read. And trying, it's not a question of bringing a literary sensibility, as people sometimes say, I hate that idiom, but the experience of reading which is not that, and is resolutely and even militantly not that, of the professional philosopher or the professional scholar or the Kantian, is part of the gesture of the book. Some of that I fell into, some of that I cultivated, some of that I theorized, but it's, I guess, part of who I am and the work that I've done, that it's often in that gap between the official version and the something else. So I guess the propos déclaré and the autre geste, the what's declared, what's described, and what's declared and what's described, and those Derridian formulations. That's what interests me, and in a way that's the only thing that interests me. I see, I can perhaps pick up on Sergio's question in the chat, which I've now had a chance to read.
Naomi, would you like to respond before we move on to Sergio's question?
I can say something very briefly that I was sort of thinking, hearing Peggy and Jeff speak, which is that, you know, the sense that erudition is always kind of prosthetic or articulated anyway in some way, but it's always somewhat rude or crude, perhaps we might say, like, or coming out of crudeness, but sort of never completely, always a bit undignified, in other words. And I wonder if there's that sense of an erudition worthy of the name, because the book does read as incredibly erudite, but that erudition, you know, requires that kind of prosthetic piggybacking, and hence a sort of admission, if you like, of a certain rudeness before the erudition that comes. But it seems to fit well with what you say about the digne de ce nom in the same way.
Okay, thank you. I think that's right. I don't know exactly how rude it is.
I meant it only because there's that erudition contains the word rude. I didn't mean it in the modern sense of you're being rude.
Well, I think I'm also being rude. I mean, I've also made a career of being rude. And I'm rude in this book about various people who, so far at least, nobody's given me a hard time about. And that is, I think, of a piece with the structures that I've been describing. So there's something ambiguous, let me say no more than that, in this gesture. It could seem ridiculously narcissistic, I guess, in saying what I'm doing is not that erudition thing, it's something else. I'm in touch with some of that erudition that other people have done, and I'm grateful for it. The people who do editions and things, it's incredible the work that's done that enables us to read sometimes. So the just reading also covers a whole set of relationships to the different technologies of the book, if I can use that idiom, and how editions are put together and whether they're reliable or not. And, you know, there'd be a whole set of things to say about that as well. And then the moment of rudeness where you say, that's not what I'm doing. And in a sense, I don't care about that. I'm grateful it gave me something to read. Thanks, but no thanks. Something else is now going to happen. So I guess that's related to that militant, but thereby perhaps inevitably rude edge.
Or like the risk that you'd be sneering about sneering moralism.
Yeah, that you pointed out to me a little ago, that I'm now very sensitive to the thought that my reference to Zizek or Agamben or Badiou's sneering moralism is itself a sneeringly moralistic characterization. So
it made me smile. I wasn't criticizing it. I enjoyed the moment a lot.
I'll try to do better with that. Or Esposito in this book, who I think deserved a little sneer as well. Sergio's question is
Sergio, did you want to read your question or paraphrase your question, or shall we just let everyone read it for themselves? So, always nice to hear your voice.
This is, I don't think it's necessary. Jeff already get the question, so
okay,
it's up to you.
Great, Jeff.
Unless it's too complicated, my grammar is too complicated, so I can paraphrase.
I think, I mean, one thing I wanted to say about this, which is why I jumped on it when I saw it, is perhaps less substantive. And again, it's a tiny little bit autobiographical or confessional. And that is that, as some of you know, Scatter, when I first formulated it as something like a project, was never supposed to be a book. Certainly not a printed volume or 2 printed volumes. It started out, as I think I explain in Scatter 2, as at least a fantasy of something that would have some electronic form of realization that would be itself much more scattered than the final print version turns out to be, that would make extensive use of hyperlinks, that would have different levels, that would, crucially for me, part of the fantasy was that the reader could never know if they'd read it all. That there would be no way of saying I read the whole thing. You just wouldn't know how much you'd read. There would be labyrinthine paths that could be taken. Some of them would lead into blind alleys. Some of them would lead into primary text, and you'd be stuck reading Hobbes for the rest of your life. Some of them would loop back in. So that was the guiding fantasy that, for various reasons, hasn't come to fruition here. So there was definitely in the thought of the project already a relationship to the material mediations you're talking about, Sergio, that mean that the form of the book has a certain political import, let's call it, say it like that, that presumably in order to be consistent with the kind of thinking that I'm defending here, one would need to question in a way that, in fact, it has not been genuinely questioned in this case. So I'm interested in pursuing that, and I do think, without this being a digital humanities thing or an online thing, or all the ways that those possibilities have been and are being and will be, I'm sure, appropriated, that would attempt to have a more inventive and interesting relationship to some of those possibilities. Because of course, some of the erudition involved is also much helped by electronic texts that are searchable, that in some cases have already been marked up in certain ways, that are available online. Because one thing you can say about textual material available online is that the Christians and the Marxists have both done a terrific job in making their materials easily available, searchable. They provide a lot of tools of erudition built into the way they've related to that material. So I'm genuinely interested in pursuing that. Somewhere I regret the fact that scatter did not take the form I'd originally fantasized for it, and tried to realize to some extent. And I think, Naomi, just in passing, that the only reference I ever make to scat as a form of singing, to scatting, is in fact in an earlier version that was attempting to capture some of that more electronic scattered version of things. So I do think, Sergio, that there's a potential for democratizing, politicizing in a certain way. I also think, however, that of course, it's not just that that is then opposed to what Hobbes might have said, because Hobbes, at least the way I'm trying to read him, also said what he didn't want to say, right? So when Hobbes angrily denounces in the Elements of Law the fact that ratio has largely become oratio, and he wants to reverse that trend, whence his extraordinarily funny irascibility when faced with rhetoric, figurative language, and so on. The great thing about Hobbes, which makes it such a fantastic text, such a fantastic reading text, is that he's also constantly saying or doing the opposite of what his official doctrine is trying to put forth. And to some extent, that's also true of some of the other authors, Rousseau, for example. It's also true of those. So the kinds of revisions that we might be interested in terms of syllabus, curriculum, relation to the book, relation to the text, shouldn't, of course, replace or claim to supersede that kind of possibility which is given in the traditional print version of the Leviathan, if only you open it and read it. And by the time you get to the end of part 2, realize that the kind of reading you've been doing does not answer to Hobbes's dream of a kind of sovereignist, non-interpretive, straightforwardly non-rhetorical kind of reading.
Great.
Matthias Fritsch has a question. Matthias? It looks like you're unmuted, but I can't hear you.
No, I can't hear you either, Matthias. I can read your question.
Okay, perhaps we shall.
Do you hear me? We don't hear you. Do you hear me, Matthias? You do hear me. Okay, I'll take your question from the chat and I'll try to answer it. I'm sure that there must be a politics that, as you put it, is more amenable to that openness that's involved in the relation of reading that I'm talking about. Part of the problem that I've come to have with my own formulation of the politics of politics, which I was very pleased with when I first came up with it about 10 years ago, is that its endless recursiveness means that the politics of politics affects the term politics in a way that means that it's no longer the politics it started out being. So it's not simply, politics of politics is not simply a way of saying there's an irreducible element of realpolitik in anything we call politics, though it's also about registering that. It's a thought that in that recursiveness, there's some transformation that is possible of politics. So the object of my sneering denunciation of sneering moralism is a view of politics that thinks it's possible simply to eradicate that dimension of politics. I don't think it's possible to eradicate, but that doesn't mean, and that's why I've come to be a little uneasy about my use of this formula, it doesn't mean that I'm simply either promoting or recommending what I call the politics of politics. I'm not saying because these elements are irreducible, let's go with it and make them more so. It's that there's a negotiation between politics and the politics of politics that I hope is more amenable to hope in that way that I think Simon was intending the term. I don't think hope is a word I use very often, but related to that kind of openness. So I think there would be a delusion in thinking that it's possible to read in and welcome the other in that experience of reading in a way that would simply eradicate the politics of politics. I just do not think that is possible. That's the dream of piety and moralism itself. But that doesn't mean that having recognized the irreducibility of it, that the more the better, or we should all become Machiavellians, or we should all say Mitch McConnell's the way of doing the politics of politics and we should admire and emulate that, for example. So you're right to think that there must be something in between. On the one hand, that tendentially moralistic version of politics that thinks we don't need politics of politics and we can do without it, on the one hand, and on the other, a mere assertion of whatever that would then seem to imply down the line of a Machiavellianism or something of that sort. Now, Machiavelli, of course, is more complex than that. I'm caricaturing.
So I'm afraid that we have run out of time unless there's a quick question or comment. So I want to thank.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to pick up to say Jonathan's got something about scat.
Jonathan, would you like to elaborate?
A little bit
not
on
in
what
the sense
Peggy
of
had
singing.
said. I don't need to delay the event any if it's just some of my thoughts about the comment on natural and genetic inheritance in the quotation that Peggy said.
let's not talk about that because you're writing a whole dissertation about it. On the quickly on the notion of scat, in the sense that gives us the term scatological, so animal scat in this case. In the earlier version that didn't make it into the final one, but I think the one where Naomi had seen the reference to scat singing, I quoted the Oxford English Dictionary at great length, shamelessly for page after page, in its definitions of the noun scatter, the verb scatter, and then cognate terms such as scat in the sense of excrement. And that is definitely something I do not want to lose track of. There's something in the very ambiguous relationship to materialism. One of the reasons I like the word scatter is that it rhymes with matter, as I say at the very end. So there's a materialist ambition somewhere in this thinking, even though it's very suspicious of most forms of materialism because they're so idealist. And that reference to matter, I think, commits one to thinking about, seems a strange way to end the session, but maybe we will, commits one to thinking about excrement, for example.
And with that, I'd like to thank Simon, who's no longer here, Peggy, and Naomi, and of course, Jeff, for your brilliant book and your agreeing to share it with us. Thanks to everyone for attending after 14, 15 months of too much Zoom. We are all tired. I hope that everyone is beginning or about to begin a summer if you're in this hemisphere. And thanks to Jonathan for really, who really had this idea and was the spark that created this event. So lovely to see you all. Thanks again. See you soon in person, I hope.
Thank you.
I think I got the idea from Francesco, so thank you to him as well.
And thanks to Francesco then.
Thank you, Jeff.
Bye, Jeff. Bye, Aaron. Bye, Jonathan.
Bye, Aaron.
Bye.
Bye, Naomi.
Bye.